Lecture 4, June 4, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, regarding what I said to you about the concept of tendency, I should perhaps add that it would be highly worthwhile, and a very promising piece of methodological work, to compare the concept of trend, which is common in empirical sociology, with that of tendency as I attempted to elucidate to you in the last session. There are two reasons for this. On the one hand, it will show you something that I already wish to emphasize now, and which we will discuss at length in the future, namely that there is no absolute rupture, no absolute corismus, between a theory of society, whatever that might be, and the empirical investigation of society. And I think it is important for you to be aware of this from the start, so that you avoid refining and hardening the concept of social theory in the same way that is disastrously evident with empirical insight into society. Let me say in advance, in this context, that a number of findings developed in theory also belong to empirical research, and that, if this were not the case, there would have to be well-grounded objections, well-grounded suspicions about theory. The relationship is therefore an extremely difficult one and should, for heaven's sake, not be understood as a simple dichotomy. So, if you were to go home after this lecture and say to yourselves, all right, so on the one hand there is empirical research in sociology, whereas Adorno advocates a theory of society, that would be entirely wrong. For the theory I am advocating, as you will see when we go into detail, is precisely a theory that does not stand in abstract opposition to the facts with which it is concerned. On the other hand, the concept of trend differs in one decisive point from what I have explained to you as tendency. Perhaps you recall that, in those explanations, I placed the greatest emphasis on the fact that recognizing a tendency means recognizing, within the theoretical analysis of a given state, that element which qualitatively differs from the state itself, from the direction of its development, which means that it is not simply an extension of how the current state presents itself. This is precisely what is absent from the concept of trend. A trend is identified according to the schema I tried to explain to you via the silly caricature of the rabid dog. That is, it will state that something which is already becoming apparent in subjective reactions with reference to the attitudes of voters towards those whom they are to vote for example, without any numerical dominance on one side that would be considered statistically significant, as they say, nonetheless has sufficient weight that, if things continue as they are now, this can be expected to increase to such an extent that it will in fact become statistically significant. This is more or less the exact empirical definition of what is meant by a trend. Naturally, this is extremely remote from the concept of tendency as I tried to intimate to you. This is just an aside to show you that empirical observation does actually involve, in a certain sense, the same types of subjective phenomena and behavior that theory examines, but with a different emphasis. And we will consider the nature of this different emphasis in our further deliberations. But the most important, the essential thing we encountered in the last session was not actually this, but something entirely different. Namely that the question of the possibility of theory itself is not simply a matter of intellectually organizing the material, or simply a matter of the so-called productive imagination of those who investigate society, recall Edgelert-Laborg, but, and this was where we ended, is itself to a considerable and, I would say, a decisive extent dependent on the object itself in a historico-philosophical sense, namely that theories of society are not equally possible at all times. I already pointed this out last time, when I developed such concepts as totality and tendency which are closely connected, for one could almost define tendency as the dynamic laws of a totality as central aspects of a theory of society. And when I told you that something like the question of a theory is by no means an urgent one for a primitive horde society, or even for feudalism, it is no coincidence, in other words, that a theory of society in an emphatic sense came about only with the Industrial Revolution and emergent economic liberalism, which was already anticipated in extremely radical fashion by the classical national economic model in liberal theory, namely that of Adam Smith, one before being developed in its full ramifications. If, on the other hand, one no longer encounters theoretical conceptions in this emphatic sense, if Max Weber, for example, who God knows did not lack intellectual power or theoretical imagination. If anyone recognized the trend in modern society, it was truly Max Weber. If this Max Weber nonetheless refrained from formulating a real theory of society, this is due not merely to a subjective inability or the so-called decline of bourgeois thought, as theorists such as Lukács too claim with the usual glib slogans. It is due to the matter itself, namely the fact that the current society is so complex and so difficult in its construction that it resists theory, at least in the initially naive sense of an unambiguous, unqualified, direct explanation based on a few concepts. And if you can observe such a widespread distrust towards the formation of any theories today, then this distrust towards theory formation is not only what I would call a harmful and pathetic symptom of the employee mentality, which it certainly is, but it also has its basis in the matter itself, and especially in the entirely legitimate disappointment that countless so-called theoretical conceptions have failed. After all, even the race theory of the National Socialists was something like an attempt at a theory of society, but one that had completely degenerated into a delusional system and thus no longer had any basis in reason. If the disappointment over this failure of theory in the face of social reality leads to such a skepticism towards theory itself, there is historical validity in this, and this aspect must itself be taken up into a theory which has, incidentally, always been a case in the great manifestations of sociological theory, and has been conceptually neglected only in more or less superficial and apologetic harmonizing descriptions of society. So I am telling you that theory is generally imagined first of all as a unity, as a system of society, and this concept came about at the time when society, without offering any great resistance, seemed to apply such a concept, such a construction from its pure, realized concept, to itself, and that happened to be liberalism, in the sense of a purely implemented exchange society, in which all socially relevant acts are essentially determined by a calculable unit, namely the society's average working time used to produce commodities. Theory has really always been something like that. One can say that the objective character of the social theories of Smith, of Ricardo Triand, as a counterpoint, of their student and deadly critic Marx, but also the social theory of Auguste Comte, was uniform in that they started from systematic umbrella terms which they could use to explain the whole. Yet as soon as the formation of theories, for example the analysis of market society, no longer had the objectivity of the concept of value, specifically the concept of labor value, but, rather, based the explanation of society on the subjective reactions of individuals, on the needs of people and their manifold psychological impairments, it could no longer achieve such a unanimity of theory, which was expressed in the complexities and constant self-corrections of subjectively oriented social theories. I would say that, in this sense, the positive liberal theories and the negative ones such as those of Marx and Engels, the critical theories, were in agreement. That is, Marx's theory is entirely traditional in viewing society as a system, a self-enclosed deductive system, only, and this only is meant with great irony, with the twist that it asks, now look at this system, what happens to it because of its absolute consistency? But the notion of the objectivity of an internally congruent context is shared by the classical economists, and the classical economists were always additionally theorists of society as a whole, and their great critics. It is fair to say that all these theorems are attempts, in a sense, to capture terminologically the rupturing dynamic of society as formulated especially in the purely sociological and not properly economic theories of the time, namely those of Saint-Simon and Comte, namely that element which resists being tied to particular invariants. They are dynamic systems in a very similar way to the systems of so-called classical German idealism, especially those of Fichte and Hegel, that is, systems which believed they could reconcile the concept of dynamics, which comes from society itself, after all, with the invariance of the concepts of its self-identical nature by claiming, especially in Hegel's case, that the essence of social dynamics is itself its invariant element, its ontology. That is, if you like, the point, or, put less respectfully, the trick, of Hegel's entire construction. With Marx, the situation is that he, how shall I put it, demands identification papers from this attempt to deduce society objectively from its constitutive concepts. he questions the basis of its validity. And naturally, this is already an admission that he has difficulties with that pure, seamless deduction of the system from its concept. For if the system could truly be deduced purely from its concept, this would essentially mean that, in the final reckoning, despite all contradictions in the details, there was something like unity. Now Marx discovered, as was already implicit in the classical economic texts, especially Ricardo's, that this unity was not quite so convincing, and the challenge: take a look at how your society really functions as a system. Take a look at what results if one imagines the liberal principle of free and fair exchange unfolding on all sides. Simultaneously means that this system, in realizing itself, becomes its own negative, that it is not the internally harmonious, congruent and thus life-guaranteeing being for society as a whole that the theory of liberalism presents. One might now say, here it is the same as with all cases of dialectic, that essentially the systematic model was already askew back then. I told you last time that the concept of tendency is constitutive of this systematic model, that is, that one can only ever speak of a system of society as a tendency, and not as something fully realized, and this, strictly speaking, already means that society tel quel, society as it is not the system that, according to its own concept, it should be. But this difference exposes itself, in keeping with a theory of tendency, not as a mere epistemological deviation of the accidental from its law, but as a law of its own. I told you that, the way things are, one can say that the deviations and contradictions which seemed only particular and quite deep in the past have, on the one hand, developed so far that they can no longer be deduced in the same form from the uniform concept of society, as is attempted in Marx's theory, but that, on the other hand, they have expanded to such a degree in empirical terms that the very idea of a theory of society, in the sense of a systematic unity, has become extremely problematic. And I think that, if I am to introduce you here to the elements of a philosophical theory of society, I should at least give you a cursory description of some of those aspects that no longer define this theoretical unity of society, and follow this with the question of whether this rules out the possibility of formulating a theory at all, as well as the question, which is admittedly a philosophical question and can only be answered philosophically, of what a theory of society should then look like, or to ask about the nature of a non-systematic theory, which we will consider later. So I will begin, and truly keep it suitably short, with the first point, that something like the unity implicit in an unconsidered concept of a theory cannot simply be stipulated for our current society. Consider that one usually speaks of our society as a market society, which means, and sanctions the fact, that the classical exchange principle of liberalism continues to apply. For the market is the literal and metaphorical place of all exchange relationships between people, and initially, in its appearance, embodies this purely implemented liberal principle. Because market society has been modified so greatly, however, one must ask, and this is a very serious question that I wish by no means to anticipate dogmatically, whether, after this modification, one can really still speak of an exchange society. My own position, to make this absolutely clear, is that it still is one, but I think that the objections to this are so numerous and so serious that it takes a certain theoretical pig-headedness to hold on to this idea. So I will name several of these modifications, and, so that you do not take the matter too lightly and think that these are only apparent phenomena, some restrictions of the pure market laws, for example, due to mere quantitative expansion, let me say in advance that the modifications of exchange society to which I shall draw your attention stem from a very serious cause, namely that, because of the class system, the class tensions and the class struggles that have taken place, as well as the class consciousness that is at least potentially evident at times, society in its existing forms, namely with private ownership of the means of production and with the universal exchange principle, could probably not have survived if these modifications had not been made. That does not mean there was a conscious reflection on this Hegel's statement that, subjectively speaking, humanity has never learned from its mistakes is probably as valid now as it was in Hegel's day. But it does mean that the necessity of dealing with a number of phenomena, especially those of crisis and unemployment, which took on a scale roughly 35 years ago that brought bourgeois society to the threshold of collapse. 4 simply forced these modifications step by step, without there being any great theoretical reflections on the decisive causes. So, in other words, the tendency, if I may return to this concept, the tendency of exchange society itself, in order for it to survive, led to those changes where one must ask whether they constitute something qualitatively different or not. So let me name a few of the most important such modifications. I will leave aside the entire phenomenon of concentration and centralization and standardization, even though it is the true reason for these modifications. I will pass over it because this phenomenon, to which I already drew your attention in the last session as a decisive one, is itself very much in keeping with the strictly maintained liberal model. And today's conflict is such that the so-called economic royalists, namely the truly orthodox liberals, are precisely the advocates of monopolism, in a sense, because the classical Smithian laissez-faire laissez-aller principle leads simply to the creation of monopoly, and because measures against corporate consolidation, as found in the American trust law as well as our antitrust legislation, are not meant to be reconcilable with this principle. Thus anyone who is still a strict and wholehearted liberal today by definition sanctions the most unchecked formation of monopolies. Perhaps I might add that the intra-social and intra-economic power of this movement towards monopolies is evidently so overwhelmingly strong that, despite this law, nothing can seriously be done about this tendency either in America or here. Despite this legislation, in the context of overall technical and economic development, I think one could show this very clearly and drastically by looking at the development of certain branches of industry both here in Germany and in America, where there are oligopolies, a few extremely powerful giant companies that have sucked up everything in sight. This is so evident that there is really something rather innocent about the idea of such anti-monopoly or antitrust legislation. So, having noted this, I will name a number of modifications that can mostly be understood as unconscious reactions to the distinction between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, which is heightened to a fantastic degree by the tendency towards monopolization. The first are state interventionism, unemployment benefits and public employment programs, whose absence would be inconceivable in any developed nation today, although they no longer have the character simply of unemployment benefit, which has a very problematic and explosive aspect. Rather, their character is that of public work or similar measures to create outlets, from the start, in case of a crisis and mass unemployment. All these institutions, and that is the entire sphere to which a term such as social market economy refers in this country, are naturally breaches of the pure competition principle inherent in the liberal model, and no longer permit any explanation of the totality of social life, and the reproduction of the life of society, with the traditional terms of a liberal exchange society. This means that, if society did not convey to its members, openly or covertly, an awareness that, should they no longer be able to support themselves with their own means, they will be supported with public means, without this awareness, which defines the entire climate of the major capitalist countries like an ether, the continuation of society in its existing forms would probably become inconceivable. And the interventionist economy first conceived by Keynes, 5, which has meanwhile become highly developed, is the theoretical expression of this end, simultaneously, an expression of the renunciation of a contradiction-free, rigorously implemented liberal model. A second aspect, to which I would like to devote a special lecture if at all possible, that is, if our time allows it, concerns the position of the proletariat, in a sense that no longer corresponds either to the classical liberal model or, on the other hand, to the Marxian model. And this is the question of the organization, and concomitantly the integration, of the proletariat. Because the workers have joined to form gigantic professional organizations. Just think of the huge organizations of the complete workforce that have existed in America since the merger of the AFL and the CIO6, which have their own bargaining power, and, as one calls it in America, the power to negotiate the most favorable possible terms with the great economic monopolies. The share of the national product received by each worker can no longer simply be expressed according to the law of supply and demand, or in the categories of the iron wage laws of Lassalle, 7, or classical Marxian theory, or indeed classical liberal theory, which simply assumes, in Robinsonian fashion, that every worker goes to the market all alone and sells their labor power, then receives whatever can be paid according to demand. But today, with these gigantic organizations in the background, the worker is no longer in this position of relative powerlessness in relation to the employer, but rather, to an extent, in a situation that has been termed the monopoly of work, certainly a caricature, but not without an element of truth. I told you that this development, whose significance cannot yet be assessed, and which has been described in its perspectives for the whole complex of the social sciences, but by no means fully developed, is also irreconcilable with Marx's theory. But this is not only because it modifies the pure theory of labor value in a certain way, one might say, but also for a much deeper reason that is decisive for a theory of society. Marx's theory rests essentially on the assumption of, shall we say, the social extraterritoriality of the proletariat, that is, the fact that, on the one hand, the proletariat not only reproduces the life of society as a whole through the sale of the commodity of labor power, but also gains a share in this society by receiving a minimum. At the same time, it is defined as something essentially located outside of society, as its more or less defenseless object or victim. This should certainly be understood in terms of the specific historical situation during the 50 years of the First Industrial Revolution, when groups that had not previously belonged to the industrial proletariat, the craftsmen who were made obsolete by machines, as well as large numbers of expropriated small farmers, were forced to sell their labor power under the most miserable terms, and, perhaps precisely because they did not have a share in all manner of things, they were within society, to the extent that they helped it to live, but outside it in a similar way to slaves in ancient society, who were subject to an extraterritoriality that prevented them from sharing in the concept of the human being, aid as you know, or permitted it only with severe restrictions. The phenomenon we observe today is first and foremost simply that the proletariat is integrated, which means that the proletariat reproduces its life beyond the minimum level within the framework of bourgeois society. That what used to be the most visible and drastic differences between a proletarian and a bourgeois, a so-called white-collar proletarian, meaning a clerk, are become ever smaller, and that the proletariat has above all lost its role as an explosive power unreconciled with society, which it still had as long as it was being dragged into the force field of capitalist development as something pre-capitalist, and is now experiencing firsthand what it meant to be socially uprooted and, in this sense, affected by society, and it therefore acquired the very revolutionary or rather rebellious impulses which both the early socialists and the classical theories of socialism and anarchism believed they were taking up. So, in a certain sense, to connect this to our larger theme, you could say that society thus became more similar to a system than it had been at the time of the classical socialist conception, because this obvious contradiction no longer exists. But you can already see here that this move towards the systematic, this stricter adherence to its own concept, does have a somewhat uneasy character, if one can speak of such a thing, that this construction of an integrated and independent proletariat is no longer strictly compatible either with the model of free wage labor or with the Marxian model of increasing immiseration, and thus the necessary movement of society towards a disaster that has been delayed far too long for us simply to ignore it, unless one actually wants to turn socialism into pure apocalypticism. So this integration of the proletariat, the fact that, in a sense which is very difficult to pin down, the workers have themselves become bourgeois, is irreconcilable with the model of a purely bourgeois society, because one could say that the difference between bourgeois society and the proletariat, the underclass, is immanent in the very concept of a purely bourgeois society. I will explain the resulting changes in the consciousness also of proletarians, with all the implications of this phenomenon as one of the most important for a theory of society, in a special session. But first, I will speak to you a little more next Tuesday about the modifying aspects that make something like the traditional concept of a unified theory so extraordinarily problematic. Lecture 5, June 16, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I have the pleasure of drawing your attention to a lecture that will take place tonight at the Seminar for the Science of Politics, at the invitation of my colleague, Fischer, 1. This lecture will be given by Professor Lucien Goldman from Paris, who, to my particular pleasure, is also present at this session. Did you not understand, or is that a protest? Did you not understand what I said? So, it is a lecture by Professor Lucien Goldman from Paris entitled Marxism and Contemporary Society. 2 and will take place at 8 p.m. Contemporary lecture Theodor. I would strongly recommend attending this lecture, which naturally has a very close connection with the content of our course. Perhaps I can remind you, after we had to break off again last week 3, that I had tried to give you some insights into the difficulty of theory today, not in connection with abstract methodological problems, for I tried, and will continue today, to show you with a few models how difficult it is to form an adequate theory that addresses relevant questions about society. It is, after all, as you know, my custom not to separate methodological and so-called contextual questions. Rather, as far as possible when speaking concretely of methodology, I do not use more or less trivial examples but address issues that are theoretically relevant, at least in my view. Today I wish to pursue the problem I mentioned earlier when I referred to the role of trade unions and the increasing integration of the proletariat into society as a whole. I will do so by asking why the current situation presents a theoretical understanding with difficulties and, through these difficulties, encourages that fundamental renunciation of theory which is codified by the so-called positivistic tendencies in social science and, as it were, mirrored in the latter's own epistemology. In other words, in connection with this problem, I now wish to address the problem of the proletariat as it manifests itself in empirical social research. And here I wish to proceed from certain findings from a study about work climate carried out by the Institute for Social Research some 10 years ago and published in a book, which is no longer available, and would probably be rather difficult for you to find, whose main results were interpreted and preserved in the recently published book on industrial sociology by my friend Ludwig von Friedberg. 5. I therefore strongly recommend that you consult von Friedberg's book, 6, which has appeared in our series The Frankfurter Betracht zur Soziologie, in connection with what I will tell you about the interpretation of this study. The matter in question is the system immanence of the proletariat, or the so-called integration of the proletariat, from the perspective of the proletarian consciousness. I consider this especially important because a large part of the established contemporary reflections on the problem of class in modern society deals one-sidedly and exclusively with people's consciousness, with class consciousness, and behaves as if the question of class were essentially a question of consciousness, leaving aside the fact that, in the theory where the concept of the proletariat as such has a systematic status, the attempt was made to define the proletariat objectively, namely by its position in relation to the means of production, by being cut off from control over the means of production, whereas the consciousness of the proletariat has never aligned itself with this objective position in any straightforward fashion. This is a fact of fundamental importance if one ever asks as to the possibility of a theory of modern society, because we are faced today with the very difficult contradiction that such a subjective consciousness in the proletariat of being such, I would not say it no longer exists, but that, at least in some important capitalist countries like America, this consciousness barely exists, and that there is evidently a tendency in countries where the labor movement has such an extensive, and, I would say, such a theoretical tradition as in Germany for this consciousness to play an ever smaller part. Of course, when we look at the results of the studies on workers, you all know the very important ones by Bart and Poppets, 7, or also those of Lutz, Braun and Perker, 8, to name only a few of the most important people working in this field over the last decade. You should acquaint yourselves with these matters, because empirical studies truly form an integral element of theoretical reflection here in all these studies, and in ours too. There is certainly no lack of critical statements by the workers. So if one is looking for assessments of the so-called work climate, one will repeatedly encounter a wealth of critical ones, although a quantification is very difficult for certain structural reasons. Let me already say that this is so difficult because it is very hard to decide how far these critical statements refer to structural issues in society, and how far to only limited situations within the companies. Thus the impression one gains when dealing with this material is primarily that, at least in Germany, Some people still employ old terms from the tradition of the former Marxist parties in Germany. They speak of capital and labor, and the opposition of capital and labor, but no longer really mean what was meant by those terms. What they in their critique mean are so-called grievances, unpleasant conditions within particular companies or particular company situations that are imagined as fundamentally corrigible, as ones that can be resolved through sensible cooperation under whatever conditions happen to be given. But if, as I told you, the authors speak nonetheless of capital and labor, then these terms almost have the character of natural occurrences, which is of course extremely at odds with the conception from which this terminology has been taken. This seems to be the way that countless workers today, at least in Germany, think about it. One must be very careful with generalizations about such things across national boundaries. There are countries such as Italy, and especially France, where things are probably entirely different, but in this country, at least, what is meant is a form of unchanging, natural framework in which certain frictions ensue but can be resolved, oppositions of, to quote a famous phrase, a non-antagonistic character. 9. When you look at complaints, for example, you will find complaints. This is highly characteristic, especially about superiors, mostly in the lower tiers. In other words, superiors like the foreman or the overseer in the mine, who come into direct contact with the workers. These superiors are very often held responsible as individuals, as persons, for what happens, completely ignoring their function, completely ignoring the fact that, for example, they are generally obliged to maintain a certain level of production, which forces them to exert pressure on the workers, which they are, in reality, simply passing on. Let me note here, this is really a chapter of ideology critique, but you can already see in this how far the issues of so-called ideology and the issue of immediate, lived experience today have merged, that you are looking at a phenomenon which is characteristic of an ideological area that I take the liberty of calling the phenomenon of personalization. By personalization I mean a habit of thinking that is very widespread today, that one attributes certain grievances, whether one would normally consider them so blind and fateful that one has no power over them, or at least looks for a scapegoat or a living person to cling to so that one can somehow deal with it, to avoid being hopelessly consumed by the awareness of one's alienation that one attributes, to resolve Myanikaluthon, such grievances to the fault of persons, whereas one associates positive experiences such as the economic boom, the boom that has already lasted 15 years, or the massive rise in living standards in Germany, with the economic policy adopted in Germany, and even considers them the work of individual politicians, without considering for a moment that this boom originated in structural aspects of the reconstruction of a bummed-out, war-ravaged country. This factor of personalization has been a trick for a very long time, incidentally, and its function seems to grow in virtually direct proportion to mass society, that is, to the alienation of the masses from the most important decisions, in direct proportion to the anonymity of social decisions. In the gigantic country of America, for example, with its immense population, where the candidates in the important elections are, of course, exclusively exponents of objectively warring interest groups, the official ideology, which, as surveys show, fools countless voters, is still that the purpose of a presidential or whatever election is to find the so-called best man for the job, despite the fact that in general, of course, none of the voters can remotely assess whether Mr. X or Mr. Y really is the better man. This is such a simple point that one would really expect anyone who was not a complete imbecile to grasp it, but evidently the affective power inside people which resists objective, anonymous laws governing events over their heads is so immense that people will fall for this mechanism of personalization, even against their better judgment. So you can see here in this one fulcrum, as it were, how closely seeing through ideologies is connected to gaining insight into the social reality itself. That is why I elaborated somewhat on this point. On the other hand, if one considers these matters cautiously and fairly, one should also say that there is an element of truth in the tendency of so many workers to blame their superiors for objective difficulties resulting from the employment relationship itself, and one must never simply disregard such concrete elements with a stroke of the pen, because those lower superiors, the ones with whom the workers come into direct contact, are the ones who actually give the system a tangible form for them. Roughly in the same way that the anger of the petty bourgeoisie about the large retail centers stems from the fact that they are being handed the bill, as it were, that is, they realize how little they actually have and how little they can consume, not when the man receives his pay envelope or salary, but when his wife is forced to make ends meet, and, as one says in America, to use the meager check she has received to procure food, clothes and whatever else. My point is that even the deprivation phenomena I am describing to you, such as personalization, have their basis in the matter itself, and so far as people's unreflecting, non-theoretical experience does not yield anything else, you may already conclude from this, at least in the form of a postulation, that anything resembling an understanding of society is impossible today except via theory, via theoretical thought, and that a theory-free so-called empiricism is merely an ideology that captures only apparent phenomena, and this pragmatic perspective, if you will, is certainly not the least important of those forcing us to seek the crystallization of theory. Now, the workers very often voice a certain discontent with the current situation, but very often this discontent appears, I will keep citing our results 10, in the complaint that the workers of today no longer show solidarity with one another, but instead behave towards one another in a more or less atomized state. It is quite astounding, I must point out, that the suffering of a particular group is reduced by that same group more or less to itself, not to the objective conditions. One is reminded somewhat of the arguments one encounters in surveys about democracy in Germany, where people making a case against democracy rationalize it by saying of themselves, well, we're not ready for democracy yet. I will not discuss the socio-psychological consequences of this, especially the socio-psychological perspectives it opens up, but will leave that to your theoretical imagination. There does initially seem to be a degree of plausibility to this, the fact that, in the past, theory itself was binding, that there were certain programs, that people believed the implementation of these programs was directly imminent, and thus that the situation of the workers, in terms of their mutual solidarity, was possibly better than it is today. One should beware of ideologizations here too, however, and be especially careful not to evoke a supposedly glorious past simply because of certain flaws in the present state. In reality, it is far harder to establish what is behind these complaints than this argumentation suggests, especially because one cannot be sure whether more immediate pressure and more faith in the possibility of change would have brought about more solidarity, or whether this change might have been cancelled out by a less advanced state of consciousness among the workers, some of whom were simply dragged into that sphere without being equipped for reflection in the way that people are today, simply because of the increase in communication. To be scientifically conscientious, at any rate, one would have to say that there are no figures to compare concerning this question of solidarity. The most plausible option is probably that this fantastic, legendary solidarity probably existed within certain cadres, certain leadership groups in the organized workforce, from where people then tried with varying success to implant it in the rank and file, and, whereas the decisive aspect today is more that, at least in Germany, such cadres who were able to provoke such a sense of solidarity hardly exist any longer. In addition, if one posits for a moment this apparent fact of an increasing bourgeoisification of the proletariat, we will later address this apparent fact in a very fundamental sense. It naturally makes sense that the characteristic behavioral patterns which would otherwise apply within the dominant group in society, namely the behaviors of the competition, would also become increasingly common in the proletariat. The more bourgeois the workers feel in their own subjective consciousness, the more they will view one another as competitors, just as other groups in society do. And, incidentally, there is actually no lack of symptoms in empirical research showing that, clearly, there are already competing groups within today's workforce. The most important competition is between those factions involved in the actual production, who thus consider themselves the productive workers according to the old definition of Saint-Simon and Marx 11, whose numbers are dwindling because of the increasing mechanization and automation, and, on the other side, the countless individuals who carry out repairs, which the classical definition views as mere services, but are becoming more important in a sense. primarily because they are becoming ever larger as a group in comparison with the actual production workers, and therefore, to the extent that there is something like a numerically significant class, are becoming increasingly significant within that class. Between these two groups, the growing and, in a sense, more modern group of neo-craftsmen and repairs, on the one hand, and the classical workers who consider themselves productive workers but who are becoming less numerous, on the other, one can observe the development of increasingly clear mechanisms of competition. And here, too, the people are entirely naive about this competition, because they cannot grasp the social mechanisms that bring about such a thing without theory, and because there is not really any genuinely contemporary, fully developed theory that explains these differences. Beyond these aspects, however, there are a great many other motifs that I will show you to refer to what one could, from the outside and somewhat too lightly, call integration, and what I will instead term the systematic thinking or system, immanent consciousness of the workers. Of these, the best known and most important is the improvement of general living and working conditions, which one naturally cannot ignore. Any theory of society which neglected the fact that the lot of workers today is actually no longer as it was in the classical analyses of Marx and Engels, that, simply stated, the proletarians today genuinely have more to lose than their chains, 12 namely their small car or motorcycle as well. Generally speaking, leaving aside the question of whether these cars and motorcycles are perhaps a sublimated form of chains, there is no doubt about that, at least. And if one fails to incorporate these aspects into one's theoretical reflection, it is abstract in the bad sense and falls short of the phenomenon in question. Then one must think of the radical depoliticization of the trade unions in this country, at least, and in connection with that also the lack of political training, which is tied to the problematics of political education as a whole, which I will not dwell on in this context. There is no doubt, at any rate, that something like a true political training, in the theoretical sense, no longer exists, and if anyone does attempt such political training, they will not usually have such a good time of it. A significant factor for the tendencies I have characterized, which are generally just presented to you as a trend that is so strong that one must quite simply take note of it, without giving it any further thought, which means without analyzing its reasons, is a rather important element on the side of subjective consciousness, the skepticism towards all politics that took hold of people in Germany, and I mean the entire population, not just the workers, after Hitler. For Hitler, tant bien que mal, did achieve one thing, an incredible politicization of consciousness. The content of this politicization was wrong and ghastly, but recalling the time before my emigration, when I actually experienced Hitler in the flesh, I can tell you that the extent to which every issue in the world was seen as a political issue, in the consciousness of the masses too, was incredible, and that one can barely imagine today just how far that went. This has changed radically. People saw where things can lead when someone decides to become a politician, which is why they are now fed up with the entire sphere of politics and think it best for them to stay away from it. The entire Restoration period in Germany can be considered a period of reprivatization in a number of ways, both in the sense of state-owned enterprises turning back into private enterprises, or the seeming transformation of the large businesses into private property, and in the sense of a reprivatization of individual consciousness, but a reprivatization in which there is little virtue, because, despite this reprivatization of consciousness, people are objectively tied to their socio-economic contexts more than ever. For now I would like to touch on this problem of politics at least, with some short theses, because I think it is fitting to address the sphere of politics in a course of lectures on the theory of society. On the one hand, the entire sphere of politics is certainly an aspect of ideology, that is to say, it seems as if the power struggles take place in the political sphere proper, the sphere of government, the sphere of legislation, the sphere of elections, in all these elements of political institutions as if they were the matter itself, whereas they are epiphenomenon over the real social process that carries them. It is especially difficult to see through this, as simple as it may sound if I say this to you now, because the things with which people are first confronted, aside from persons, are really political institutions that represent the social, and because it already demands a substantial and analytical process of abstraction to perceive the underlying play of social forces. It is no coincidence that the theory of the state is incomparably older than the theory of society, which, though it too can be traced back to the Stoics, is, as a distinct theory, little older than the 18th or, at the earliest, the late 17th century. But, on the other hand, the sphere of politics as the sphere of seizing power, where it is quite possible for the entire fundamental conditions of life, especially the economic ones, to be decided, is after all a sphere, an ideology, that holds within it the potential to become something more, something different from mere ideology. If you want to see a demonstration of what is meant by dialectic, by social dialectic, in a very simple model, then such a definition of the nature of the political is probably the best paradigm one could find, because here you find two opposing aspects united in a single concept and almost in the same sphere. On the one hand, this ideological aspect that politics only conceals what is really going on underneath, and, on the other hand, the political is the potential to change precisely what is going on underneath. So, to be precise, politics is the manifestation of ideology that can take hold of the substructure and move it in a different direction, as the possibility of thinking the contradictory and the dialectical is increasingly in decline and is giving way to a simple binary logic in people's consciousness. Such a concept of politics is no longer grasped. The possibility of politics as something other than ideology is no longer even conceived. Instead, politics in general is seen only as the ideology it also is, namely as the sphere of a negotiation of interests that is actually determined by far stronger interests over which individuals believe they have no power, and which as a result they view largely with disinterest. On the other hand, the sphere of the political is now equally compromised, and this applies especially to the workers by the abuse of what has happened to politics in the entire Eastern Bloc under the name of socialism, where politics, to a large extent, is genuinely like politics in the bad traditional sense, an expansive, more or less imperialistic power politics, or certain groups clinging to those in power while completely abandoning the actual socialist tenet that political action should end in the abolition of politics. But God knows that people over there play politics, the famous great game of politics, the same as they always have. If one also takes into account the stark difference of living standards, especially among the workers, between the people beyond the border and in this country, then this impossibility of having a real idea of politics is entirely understandable, all the more because the element on which the entire Soviet conception of politics rests, namely the idea of revolution and the possibility of revolution as such, has obviously become. I refer here to the extremely interesting study in America written by Amar von Kempsky about this point 13, something so technologically questionable, or perhaps even entirely impossible, through a concentration of military resources that presumably consign a notion such as that of armed revolt to what one can only call the realm of childish dreams. And so it is understandable if a concept becomes a myth at the moment when it obviously and actually becomes what it had previously only been in a bad theory, namely that of Sorel, 14, and can then, within the, in some ways, also, enlightened humanity of today, no longer take hold of the masses. To avoid any misunderstanding, ladies and gentlemen, I am not saying all this in order to justify these phenomena of subjective consciousness, but I think that the task of a theory is precisely to grasp all changes of consciousness, and also of reality, that are generally, according to the dominant thinking habits today, simply tolerated and accepted as such. I have referred to any mere acceptance of what is the case with the term I stole from psychology and transferred to sociology, concretism. This is analogous to the psychopathology of people who are incapable of abstraction and therefore do nothing but cling to what is closest. A number of analyses of the state of the proletariat, for example the famous study by Bednarek 15 about the young Austrian worker, which some of you will perhaps also have come across, essentially point to the concretism thesis, to the fact that people are unable to resist their immediate interest, the aforementioned motorcycle, the television, and a number of other things and behaviors connected to all this, and that they are consequently also prevented subjectively from attaining that theoretical consciousness which, as I showed you, faces such extraordinary objective obstacles, there has always been a degree of truth in the concretism of those who have to bear the burden. I think that the people who are given the burden, and consequently walk bent over with their heads bowed, that it has always been very hard for them to hold those heads up high, to stay with the image, and see more than their immediate interests. Expanding one's consciousness, having a wide, unrestricted view, is itself already a form of privilege. Yet those of us who like to think we have such a consciousness often fail to realize how much it is due to our inherited advantage that we are even able and allowed to have it. On the other hand, it does strike me as highly probable that this phenomenon of concretism, which people so often ascribe to the workers, especially the young workers, is not actually group-specific but, rather, a phenomenon that has spread throughout society as a whole in connection with all the things I have described to you, and hence that this restriction to the immediate, and the decision to clench one's teeth and avoid looking beyond what is closest at all costs, that this is where we find something resembling solidarity in society as a whole. Lecture 6, June 18, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session, in which I did not remotely get as far as I had intended, I began by outlining certain problems regarding the consciousness of the proletariat, always from the perspective of the difficulty of forming a theory, an adequate theory of society today, but also by attempting to contribute to such a theory with an analysis of one of its elements. Here it is actually somewhat coincidental that I am speaking about the proletariat. I could just as easily have chosen the middle class as a model for the problems of forming a theory. If I did not do so, this is simply because we have the data from the work climate study, which I attempted and will continue attempting to interpret a little for you. Now, you will perhaps remember that the last concept we arrived at was the concept of concretism, which is the tying of consciousness to the immediacy of the given conditions, and more specifically the tying of consciousness to the consumer goods that people are presented with on such an overwhelming scale today. This overwhelming quantity of consumer goods, incidentally, like the advertising apparatus, points back to objective structural problems in society. I will only touch on this, namely the whole question of overinvestment and overproduction, as well as the necessity for the system, in order to survive, to exert an additional pressure in every conceivable way in order to shackle people to these very consumer goods. So I told you that this so-called concretism is not really group-specific but, rather, this is admittedly a hypothesis, and strict researchers among you may point to a lack of certain analogous analyses for the lower middle class, or indeed the middle class, though we do know a certain amount about the lower middle class, especially here, something that is not group-specific but present in society as a whole, those phenomena that contributed to making Helmut Schelsky speak, with reference to this structural similarity of consciousness between the different classes of a leveled mid-level society, one a concept that proved to have an extremely significant effect, though I assume, after my last conversations with Schelsky himself, that he himself no longer actually adheres to this concept in the form in which it became famous. But that is how it always is for those like us. As soon as a concept we have formed is turned into a sort of master key, such concepts make us uncomfortable, but then it is usually too late. The phenomenon of concretism stands in a correlative relation to this, and, while it does not prevent the objective possibility of theory formation, the incredibly complex and ramified context makes it seem opaque to the naive person, if I may put it so crudely, by which I mean people who do not reflect on these matters, or automatically proceed from a theory. Perhaps the argument repeatedly used in this context, and used especially often by my American colleague Robert Lintou, namely that society has become so immensely complex and complicated that people cannot comprehend it and will therefore adhere to concretism, is not the last or the most profound word to be spoken on this matter. For one could certainly counter that, in our modern centralist or, as people like to say nowadays, dirigious society, countless intermediate levels between the sphere of production and the sphere of social domination on the one side, and the consciousness of the masses on the other side, have disappeared, probably, because of the incredible concentration and rationalization of the methods of production and the adaptation of social forms to these methods. Things are genuinely no longer so terribly complicated. I think you should familiarize yourselves with this thought, for complicatedness can also become an ideology of faith, and complicatedness per se takes hold of the masses. I would think that the true origin of this phenomenon of concretism lies much deeper, that it is not really true that one cannot trace social processes to their relatively simple roots in economic planning and economic power structures, but rather that, because of the incredible disproportion between all individuals, every individual, wherever they might be, and the concentrated power of society, the notion of resisting this agglomerated power seems illusory, and that applies even within the labor organizations themselves, which are usually controlled so firmly by narrow groups, just as in the other forms of rule, that, within them, resistance against the general line imposed from above, I am deliberately speaking so vaguely, has a futile and superfluous quality from the outset. It should be the case, however, that theoretical interest, and this is truly an aspect of the unity of theory and practice, wanes wherever people have the feeling that they cannot really change anything about the object of theoretical reflection. This consciousness may be false, and it is a vicious circle, for this sense of powerlessness obviously leads to a reinforcement of powerlessness, because it really prevents people from doing anything but, at any rate, as soon as one has the feeling that, despite one's correct insight, one's theoretical insight into the overall structure, one cannot change it, as it seemed to the labor associations 100 or 130 years ago. One should note, the consciousness of the structural context, and even the negative consciousness of the machinery in which we are bound up, only really becomes a further source of suffering and is therefore kept at arm's length by people, and certainly not without reason, which leaves them focused on what is close, what is directly in front of them, the concrete. But that is no longer what was previously the concrete, in the sense of immediate relationships and immediately useful goods. Now the closest genuinely consists of consumer goods, commodities and mass products, whether of a material or a cultural nature, with which people are flooded for economic reasons and to which they bind themselves. Perhaps you can already recognize something here that I really consider extremely important for a theory of contemporary society, namely that the so-called leveling tendencies which can be observed, and which it would be pure superstition to deny, are not such that they reveal a leveling of society as a whole. For it is rather in the leveling itself that the supremacy of the dominant social mechanisms is reflected, and the theorists of leveling, who simply keep to the subjective consciousness that we are discussing now, very often keep quiet about this, producing a skewed picture of the social situation of consciousness. With this concretism, one must also distinguish between different aspects, for it would be wrong simply to denigrate this concretism in keeping with some Puritan notion of unchanging, divinely enthroned spiritual goods, some culturally elitist ideas, because of the immeasurably increased number of produced goods. The things to which people's consciousness attaches and limits itself genuinely offer them all manner of gratification and convenience, and to sneer at this and condemn it is the very last thing that would befit a theory driven, after all, by the material interests of dissatisfied people. On the other hand, concretism is not limited to such utility values, as I will formulate it for now, to the increase in these genuinely positive, sensually material qualities of the things that are available to people. Rather, the synthetic character of the evoked needs is expressed in the fact that, if I may fall back on an old and perhaps not completely economically ironclad formulation I used 30 years ago, three people do not only consume or attach themselves to utility values, rather, they are attached to exchange values. By this I mean that what an object represents as a monetary value, its exchange value, already becomes a source of pleasure on that basis, almost becoming a utility value, yet not directly, but mediated through this exchange value that such an object has on the market. In other words, the aspect of the commodities that is enjoyed now itself constitutes their utility value, their fetish character, one might say. And if one speaks of a reified consciousness, I would say that one of the central aspects of this reification of consciousness is that it attaches itself to the fetish character of commodities, to what things represent on the market, instead of attaching itself to what these things actually mean for people. what one usually means by prestige categories, and the meaning of the prestige associated with all manner of commodities, is a relatively superficial observation that is based only on the relative assessment of various goods, and therefore cannot grasp this very profound structural change whereby people consume exchange values instead of utility values. I certainly have no intention of selling you the theory I developed somewhat blithely in the study on fetish character, now published in Dissonances, for as wisdom that still holds absolutely true today, especially because something like the enjoyment of exchange values can only truly be grasped socio-psychologically, in terms of certain Freudian categories, and is thus, strictly speaking, not actually social. So I am very much aware of the shortcomings of such a theory. But I still think the questions raised by this for the cohesion of contemporary society are of such central significance that I would at least encourage you all to give some thought to this complex in which it is exchange value rather than utility value that causes pleasure. One can already find formulations in Marx, incidentally, that point in a strangely similar direction, such as when he says that there is a class in society that actually enjoys the negative, namely its own alienation from things and people. 5. And if one extends this Marxian formulation a little, it can certainly be brought into agreement with what I just outlined to you. When I speak of this concretism and the relative inability to recognize the connections correctly, you should think of it in very concrete terms. When a worker in a study refers with a certain generality to the powers that be, for example, without any accompanying idea of who the powers that be actually are and what their function is, let alone any notion that the behavior of the powers that be is determined by their own interests, and they are not some demigods or Epicurean gods who live up there and make carefree decisions about humans. This delusion, like all social contexts of delusion, has a social reason, namely that they will simply never reach the powers that be in the hierarchy. Society is arranged and constructed so hierarchically that the possibility of coming across the managing director is eliminated from the outset. If one never has a chance to speak to the labor relations director, who is also on the executive board, that is already something of a miracle. He will usually be extremely obliging and extremely friendly, and it may seem to the worker who is speaking to him about their problems as if he is paying attention to their interests, but in reality he will not do so seriously for different, formal sociological reasons, namely because he is on the executive board and, as they say, integrated into the uppermost hierarchy of the firm, within the consciousness of the workers. This leads, to continue this point, to the appearance that the need somehow to voice one's wishes spontaneously, and be heard, will no longer even be felt. Rather, as long as they can live a reasonably comfortable life in the economic boom, they will content themselves with delegating to functionaries, specialists for the problem complex of capital and labor, who will represent the labor side. So the division of labor between the workers and the lobbyists will be reproduced within the workers themselves, as it were. It repeats itself, which then leads both to the familiar consolidation phenomena within the labor organizations, and ultimately also to the monopolistic structures that are becoming apparent in all labor organizations, the so-called political ones as well as the apolitical trade unions. All this needs to be examined as I believe I have outlined to you, at least in its overall perspective, by means of a social theory. But here you must realize once again, in order to see the difficulties I wish to convey to you here, and to advance independently the ideas which I can essentially only set in motion with these lectures, that the theory itself, which truly attempts to get to the bottom of the relationship between capital and labor, has been elevated to a state religion in the Soviet Union and its entire eastern sphere of influence, distorting it to the point where it has virtually become the opposite of what it was once meant to be. So one cannot blame anyone in the world if they no longer adhere to this theory in its powerful, that is, socially sanctioned form, but, rather, have the gravest doubts about it. I have noticed, if I could just say this in the present context, that those students who fled from East Germany and, because they supposedly learned dialectical materialism there, have now listed this for some examinations as an area they know about, usually, and I say this without the slightest reproach towards these fellow students, merely to characterize a phenomenon that concerns more than just consciousness, have no idea of the simplest concepts in the theories of dialectical materialism and Marxian economics, that is, from the very state religion that is preached over there. Thus they produce the most nonsensical answers to questions with which one would expect them, having allegedly this theory as their basic curriculum, to be familiar. It is evidently part of the transformation of a theory into religion, that it is removed from people's living thought and living experience, and that, as soon as it is presented dogmatically, it ceases to be comprehensible and forfeits its solid theoretical structure, and only these can give it any force. If I could just say one more thing about it, this perversion of the theory of class relations I am speaking of consists primarily in the fact that Marxian theory, like every theory of society that seeks to understand society as a totality, is essentially a theory of the existing capitalist society of its respective time, and if one were put on the spot and had to name the difference between Hegel and Marx in this respect, it would initially be only that the laws of movement in society, which Hegel, Smith or Marx define as positive laws, are now criticized by Marx, and consequently all categories he uses for society are critical categories. We will yet discuss this much more fundamentally, and the aforementioned perversion or dogmatization and distortion lies in the fact that all possible categories, especially those concerning the supremacy of economics and referring to materialism, were simply elevated to positive categories in the dominant thought of the Eastern Bloc, as if dependence on a material superstructure or the primacy of economics, or even the primacy of production, which is certainly an intra-capitalist category and was described and criticized by Marx as such, as if these could simply act as the categories of a non-capitalist society too. And thanks to this sudden transformation of critical categories into invariance and into a form of basic doctrine, applying to every possible society, the concept of a theory of society, even where a developed one already exists, and people still think they can invoke it, really turns into the childish mockery that reveals itself in all manner of phenomena, some of which are familiar to you. Though I spoke of concretism as the inability to perform what the German idealist called self-elevation, incidentally, which is supposed to refer not to some cloud cuckoo land in this context, but simply to the individual consciousness freeing itself from its restriction to the immediate conditions and objects it faces, this concept of concretism is insufficient to describe what I meant. Rather, one should say that it also has a correlate which Horkheimer once termed abstractism. So, if I might return to my earlier example, the ominous talk of the powers that be, this is concretist on the one hand, because people are focused only on the foreman Meyer, who is supposed to be such a bad man, but it is simultaneously abstractist, because there is no longer any genuinely implemented notion of concrete contexts. This abstractism I would like to call the inability to have genuine experiences, and this inability to have experiences and the fixation on the mere objects of immediate exchange, which are effectively charged, idolized and fetishized by people, are essentially the same thing. This loss of the ability to experience is something that psychology found long ago, especially analytical social psychology, and for which it has also pointed to a number of psychologically genetic aspects. Those who are interested can find a great deal regarding this, in particular in the authoritarian personality. 6. But today, as the perspective we are discussing is only accidentally the subjectively psychological one, and we are interested primarily in the objectively dominant structural issues of society, I would like to draw your attention to a different aspect, namely the question, a question that has perhaps not yet been thought through in this way sufficiently radically, of whether something like experience is even still possible in the reality in which we live today. Aldous Huxley, who, as well as having some strange ideas about the correct human state, was blessed with an eye for the sinister, tried to show in Brave New World 7, I believe I once referred to it in a text 8, how the conversations between the people in the dystopia he depicts increasingly degenerate and become more and more pathetic, because they are essentially no more than conversations about different forms of commodities, produced and launched by oligopolies, from which they have to choose. Thus the tendency is for conversations to become no more than a comparison between different product catalogs. I fear there are enough conversations if one has the slightest sensorium for such things that move in this direction. At any rate, he extrapolated a tendency, extended a tendency that already exists. Probably experiences tied to what, if you will permit this abstract formulation for the moment, one might perhaps call the possibility of the new, or the openness of the world, namely that the world is not subject to laws of its own reproduction, that are preordained and set in stone, that at any moment there can be something which is not already prearranged or, in modern parlance, scheduled. But wherever that is not the case, where precisely those forms of mass production which constantly produce the same under the guise of the new result in such fixity, experience is very severely compromised in objective terms. And if people, let us say in novels, still report or deal with immediate human experience today, then the very fact of speaking about oneself, one's experience, one's immediacy, already has something that I would almost call ideological, something that pretends human immediacy and human destiny still exist, whereas we are actually all debased, even in our innermost being, to mere masks of the ghastly reality principle to which we are bound. So when some novels from all sorts of countries, avoid portraying individual destinies and become mere montages of objective social facts or contexts, one should by no means see in as simply a positivist, record-taking mindset gone wild. Rather, one should see the compulsion, the necessity, to attempt any form of utterance about this reality, to show oneself any sort of match for a reality that one can in fact no longer experience. This seems the most profound reason for those interrelated phenomena that I tried to present to you dialectically, on the one hand as concretism, the restriction to the merely existent, and on the other hand abstractism, meaning the inability to have living experience. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most dangerous habits of thinking is to blame the phenomena which I have described to you without any sugar-coating, I would say, on the workers, assuming the workers are the issue, by accusing them of so-called bourgeoisification. The late Belgian social psychologist Hendrik de Man, 9 for example, who had a background in sociology, proceeded from certain observations about the leveling of the so-called proletarian consciousness into a bourgeois consciousness to pass a sort of verdict on the bad bourgeoisified proletariat and then move more or less consistently from this verdict towards fascism, ultimately leading to his rightful expulsion from Belgium as an exponent of the same. With this bourgeoisification, whose most blatant symptoms are such concepts as the social partner, which have meanwhile become widespread in workers' circles and are possibly considered there as something especially progressive and modern. One must not hold these phenomena against the people who behave in this way, for these phenomena of the so-called bourgeoisification of the proletarian consciousness simply reflect the overall tendency of society to suck up the consciousness of the workers and to ridicule any notion that their consciousness is not immediately identical to either the consciousness of society or the interests of society as a whole. So one cannot reproach them for this, and I would like to add that, if Marx's theory of immiseration has proved to be wrong in countless spheres, and over such long time spans that one would have to be delusional simply to pass over these periods, then it is also quite unjustified to blame the workers for thinking the way people think if they have more to lose than their chains. For that is not a betrayal. Rather, such accusations against the workers in particular usually amount to agreement with those whose only response to the concerns of the labor movement is to reach for the truncheon. If the workers do indeed have more to lose than their chains, then that may be painful for the theory, but it is initially very good for the workers. And I think that a theory which fails to recognize that, and therefore does not incorporate those aspects where the way things have so far gone materially has not actually resulted in the extreme situation predicted by Marx, I think not only that acknowledging this fact is the most basic matter of academic honesty, but also that a theory which dismissed this and expected the workers to behave like starving people when they are not starving, that this would no longer even be a theory and would risk becoming a mere figment. That would not, admittedly, answer the question of whether this condition is static, whether it is really something structural, or whether that too does not belong in the realm of mere appearance. But theory must also respect appearances. That is the element of truth and positivism which one must concede, and which was conceded by no less a person than Hegel, in the famous formulation in the second part of his Science of Logic that essence must appear, 11 in that, if it does not appear, it is not actually the essence. Incidentally, the observation of the divergence between socialism as a conception of the right society, something Goldman referred to 2 days ago, with a term I did not consider very well chosen, as worldview, Weltanschauung, and, on the other hand, the immediate, concrete experience of the workers within the work process, which seems essentially causal mechanical and not finalistic, is obviously not something that was just invented yesterday. What one calls the everyday class struggle, after all, has always differed from the setting of large-scale political goals and has always had, in part, a tendency to defer the setting of political goals to the Greek kalends and thus degrade it to ideology again. This tension has expressed itself time and again in the extremely variable relationships between trade unions and political parties, and it would be a grave mistake to locate trade unions on the side of, shall we say, concretist compromise as mere lobby groups and political parties on the side of utopia. It has certainly not always been so, and at the moment, if I may venture so far into concrete social analysis for a moment, it seems that precisely because the political parties negate the fundamental tensions in party practice, it is the trade unions which must register that daily struggle, after all, but have officially been separated from politics entirely, that still have some possibility of realizing critical elements of theory within the framework of social practice. Lecture 7, June 23, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, we were involved in reflections on the subjective state of consciousness among the workers in Germany, on the problem of divergence between general socialist positions that used to be predominant though, except for some fragmented transmissions, they seem to have waned now in the young generation, and what one used to call the everyday class struggle, meaning the uninterrupted efforts within the given circumstances to create better living conditions, especially higher wages and shorter working hours. I would like to point out that, in this problem, if I may say so, there is also a direct manifestation of a philosophical one, or, to put it perhaps more accurately, one can learn paradigmatically from this very question how artificial, how deeply dictated merely by fear on both sides, is the distinction, so ingrained today, between philosophy and sociology as two separate branches. This involves a dialectical problem. Hegel taught that we do not have immediate consciousness of the whole, which is meant to be the truth, and that it should not be the abstractly separated, overarching concept of the whole but, rather, that the whole is realized only through the individual steps, the individual movements of the consciousness, and through reality which, in Hegel's philosophy, are the same thing. And Marx's theory was in agreement with the strangely paradoxical notion that a way of thinking which bases its truth claim on a totality nonetheless sees the truth manifested in the particular, the detail, rather than the general outline of the whole, especially in placing what, to use the language of the Old Testament, one might call a ban on images one on any abstract notion of a correct society, or any attempt to outline such a correct society, let alone to think up something of one's own choosing. This lent incredible weight to the next step, and the emphasis that was also applied to everyday practice in the labor movement can, here in particular, draw on the heaviest artillery from the great theoretical conceptions of the dialectical thinkers, as it were. On the other hand, it is clear that this principle